All right, morning, folks. Welcome back to session 3. Today's 10th June. We're going to cover AWS S3 misconfigurations in this session. Okay, we're going to look at how you can set up S3 buckets and how people usually set up using the command line, and we'll look at what the AWS S3 console looks like, right, to get an understanding of what the service is. With a brief background about how it started and where it is now in terms of usage and stuff. And also then we'll look at the misconfigurations that S3 has, the most common ones, because if we do all the misconfigurations that S3 can have, we're going to run out of time today. Right, so I'm going to give you a couple of exercises at the end so that you can go read up and set these things up on your own. But let's focus on the thing that we have today, the most common S3 misconfigurations that we see, right? And again, because this is an attacker focused class, we're going to look at how S3 can be attacked and how you can steal data and stuff from, again, an attacker's perspective. Okay, we've done my introductions. If you folks have not read the code of conduct in the last two sessions, please make sure you go through this. I'm required to share this as part of our compliance. The chat code, yeah, okay. So I've pasted the link in the chat, so make sure that you go through that. All right. What are you going to cover today? We're going to look at AWS S3 storage, and we're going to look at it from from a ClickOpsy point of view. We're going to look at the AWS console, and while I'm doing this on screen, again, I need you folks to look at it from on your screens as well. Browse through the application the way I'm browsing it. Take a look at the interface, the S3 console itself. If you folks have not looked at it before, there are a bunch of new features that S3 AWS has added. So take a look at those as well. I'll talk about those when you're looking at the AWS console. We'll set up the lab, the tiny lab here. We'll set that up, and then we'll look at the S3 misconfigurations. And then, as usual, as our class goes, we'll undo the AWS changes that we have done. Just a brief background. Not a lot of people know this. S3 was the second service that AWS started way back in March 14, 2006. Right? Any guesses what the first service was that AWS launched? EC2. Oh, that's a common misconception. But EC2 is close. It's the third, I think. Okay, that was a trick question. You need to find this out. Okay, it's interesting how that service, which became the first service to be launched much before S3, how that came into being, right? So moving on, S3 is a cloud-based object storage service. Essentially, we know S3 as daily users, right? A lot of websites use S3 to store objects. Basically, it offers a scalable and durable storage for various types of data, right? And it doesn't differentiate between the type of data that you put on S3. It doesn't discriminate. It doesn't say, oh, you're not allowed to host, say, a type of executables, for example, right? So you have images, videos, documents. Doesn't matter what, as long as it's an object, as long as it's a file, it can get into S3. Okay? You can create up to 100 buckets in each AWS account. Okay, so each one of you can create up to 100 buckets within your accounts, and there's no limit on the number of objects you can store in the bucket. If you need more than 100 buckets, right, I'm sure some of you will do. If you need more than 100 buckets in your AWS account, you need to raise a service limit increase, right? And AWS has a service limit page where there are a lot of default limitations or limits on created on different services in AWS, and you can use this page to increase the service limits, right? Like the number of VPCs, for example, or the number of organizations you can create, right? Accounts that you can add to an organization. So you can raise the request to 1,000 more buckets. The maximum limit for an object is 5 terabytes. Any object larger than that is broken down into chunks, simply because that's how the file upload or the object upload API works. You need to break the object into more parts. Right? So the maximum largest chunk that you can upload is a 5 terabyte object, right? And currently, I don't have the latest numbers, but pick this up from Wikipedia. S3 stores more than 100 trillion objects across like its entire infrastructure as of March 2021. Definitely this number is on the higher end now. And think of any company out there, right? Any major company, Netflix, for example, or Reddit, right? All of these major players in the industry, regardless of what industry verticals they've been, they have used S3, or they're currently using S3 as one of their service backends, right? But looking from an attacker's perspective, security perspective, from our perspective, we see that S3 buckets and object access is restricted to only the resource owner. It essentially means the AWS account, not the user, right? The AWS account that created the resource. Okay, like if I create a bucket, because I belong to the account that I created it from, the entire account will have access to the S3 bucket. Obviously, IAM users are required to have relevant S3 permissions, but the restriction is limited to the account currently that created the bucket. You can also obviously create cross-account references so that you have a separate account, right? With the ability to create objects within an S3 using bucket policies. All IAM users, as I mentioned, with S3 access. You remember in the last session, we added different permissions to IAM users. You can add S3 permissions to an IAM user, and that IAM user would have access to the bucket. And bucket policies can be further used to restrict public access. Okay, we're going to see what bucket policies also look like. All objects are now, earlier it was not the case, but all objects are now encrypted server side. The SSE server side encryption is now enabled on all objects and in transit between bucket to bucket transfers. You can also have additional customer managed key created in KMS. KMS is another service in AWS, and you can have a CMK created in KMS and use that to encrypt objects within S3. And an interesting use case that a lot of people use S3 for is they have objects that are hosted in S3. So you have like a static website, right? And you can give it a domain name, and that domain name could be example.com for that case. And the backend would be an S3 bucket, right? So you can serve files even with CORS implementation and things like that over S3, and then definitely as a CloudFront backend as well, right? To have CDN support, for example. S3 also for the wrong reasons and the wrong misconfigurations out there. Most common reason for data breaches either is via misconfigured access or leftover sensitive data. So you may have a bucket that's actually secured, right? But an object there's a policy for a particular object or an ACL for an object that allows public access, right? Or buckets that have been created a long time ago. Now, for example, when you create an S3 bucket, the bucket is private by default, right? That was not the case always. You could create a bucket and it would be public, and then you had to make it private at some point in time early in the history of AWS S3. Okay. This is the most common interface that attackers have to S3 is via URLs, right? You may have seen endpoints, like, or if you found S3 buckets in the wild or in code or in any place like that, you would have the S3 URL. Okay? So there are two types of what we call the standard, I would say, for AWS S3, the virtual hosted and the path style access. Right? The virtual hosted style is the more predominant one because path style access is actually being deprecated now. And at some point in time, they haven't told what date, but at some point in time, path style access will stop working. Virtual hosted style is the one that we are most familiar with as well. Right? You have bucket name .s3, region code, and Amazon AWS.com. Okay. Again, several years ago, you didn't have region code present inside Amazon in the domain name. Right? It was simply bucket name. Say bucket was called Apple, right, or fruits for that matter. fruits.s3.amazonaws.com/object name, right? And then they started adding region code because you started running out of DNS compliant names, right? So bucket name .s3.us east 1, for example, .amazonaws.com/key name. And there's an example right there with US West as the region. Path style access is where you have bucket as a folder, right? This appears to be the most logical way of addressing buckets, because a lot of folks look at buckets as, and it's not very difficult to understand why. A lot of folks look at buckets that have folder name, right? So you essentially have a bucket and then you have folders within it, right? But the bucket itself is considered to be a folder. And when you look at the web path with the path style access, you have S3 and then US East 1, AmazonAWS.com / folder name / file name / whatever, right? So that was the path style access. And we're going to keep finding these when this section that I'm going to cover on discovering buckets in like Google, for example, and then we'll see some examples that still use path style access, right? And we'll comment on them. Okay, let's quickly take a look at some S3 misconfigurations. The most commonly known one is the S3 bucket public access. And public access is achieved by having read-write access. And when you say public access simply doesn't mean read access. Although that's the most common interface that people have, because they would browse to a S3 URL and they would see a list of files and okay, the bucket is public and the contents are also public, right? So you can now download objects from within the bucket. But a lot of folks don't test this bucket for write access. Like what would happen if you can write to the S3 bucket, right? So the permission in that case is read-write access to this group and the acs.amazonaws.com /groups global. All users, this identifier denotes all AWS authenticated users. No, sorry, all users denotes everyone on the internet, right? The authenticated users group, the next one that came up on screen now, denotes all AWS authenticated users. So if you and me, for example, when we have, doesn't matter what AWS account we are operating from, if a bucket has read-write access to the authenticated users group, you would be able to read-write on that bucket. It doesn't matter who the bucket belongs to. Okay, and an interesting thing is when we do bucket discovery, when we look at some OSINT tools that we're going to look at, bucket names need not belong to the company that or the organization that the bucket name is named after, right? I could have a bucket called say Microsoft files top secret something, and you could have it or published on the internet and people are downloading files from there, and you can't make the assumption that this belongs to Microsoft, right? Simply because you can create any bucket with any name. The nomenclature is pretty open. The second misconfiguration is when you have object as access as well, right? There's a lot of assumptions that go around when saying, hey, a bucket is public, right? But that doesn't mean the objects also are public. Okay, that's a very interesting differentiation that we need to keep in mind. The bucket may be public, but the objects may be listed as well, but because of bucket policies or how the bucket has been configured, the individual objects themselves may not have public access. So you can see the object, but you can't download it, right? Again, read-write access to specific groups. And then there's an S3 bucket ACL read-write access. This is interesting because ACLs are a way of applying permissions to a bucket, right? So what if the ACL itself could be read or written over, right? And that's what this is. You have ACL read-write access to these different groups, right? And these different groups are examples. You are essentially required to have the resource mapped to a particular AWS user or a role. But in the ACL read-write access case, the misconfiguration, the permissions are so broad that other people can change the ACL itself of the bucket, right? So even if the bucket is completely private, but the ACL can be written over, you can actually override the ACL and make it a bucket public, right? So things like those are also possible. And we look at both the commands that we can use to enumerate bucket policies as well as ACLs next. Another one common misconfiguration that comes up in like your compliance scans and stuff is S3 bucket access logging. Right? So this is disabled. Access logging allows you to see what object within the bucket was accessed at what time, right? And what resource made the request. And this is required even from incident response or forensics point of view, and also to ensure that not your sensitive data is not being accessed by accidentally or otherwise by groups that you don't want. All right, as usual, there's a commands.txt file. I want all of you to go to this location. I'll paste it in chat here. Open the file, open the URL, and let me open that as well. And run the commands that are there within the file so that we set up our buckets. Let's run the commands first, then I'll show you what's being created within the AWS console. This is a file. You can actually run all of them together, but I would recommend you folks run them one at a time, please. Make sure that you're running this in with the profile masterclass. So the S3 API creates a unique bucket, because bucket names are supposed to be unique across all of AWS, right? So mine is Ocean Queen -public bucket. There you go. Okay, I think, let me know if any of those commands fail. I think the put object would fail for you folks. Tell me if that's the case. Okay, so let me just give you the location for these two files. We're good to go. Okay, so we have I'll just give you the link to duplicate those two files. These two random files, okay, they're not like relevant to the rest of the class. You can simply upload any two files, or but let's for consistency's sake, let's have, and so that the failed commands can run. Here's the URL for.
Is there a max of the object one can store bucket?
Yeah, 5 terabytes. You can store as many objects as you want, but the max size of an individual object is limited to 5 times. Okay. So if you have those two files available in the same folder from where you run the commands, it's a duplicate of one. Rerun the command, load the error for body. Again, like most AWS commands, the commands here are self-explanatory. The only bit that you would see that's not an AWS command here is using the variable union. So I created like a page that would generate two different strings as random as possible for each one of you, and it browse to that, or when you do a curl request to that page random.php, it generates a string, right? So this essential string is unique for each one of you. It becomes your public bucket and essentially is used in all of the bucket names. The first set of commands creates a bucket simply in the region US East 1 using your profile masterclass, and puts a public access block which says block public policy as false, right? So that you can set policies in this. This third command here is a new one. You, before April, you need not have done this, but ACLs by default are disabled now on AWS S3, right? If you don't run this, you can't put a bucket ACL. Okay, so what we've done is we've changed the ownership controls back to bucket owner preferred, which allows it to have ACLs, and then you upload two files. There's a board public and board.jpg in public, and so if you notice, key is what is created. So object, it's not file name on S3, it's the object, right? So the object name is the key, and body is the local file, right? So this local file is uploaded, and then a bucket ACL is put up that allows for public read write. Okay, same here, different configuration, and then again another with a different configuration. We'll see with the help of commands what these configurations look like now. But before we go there, let me just show you what's been created on S3 console. A little more easier to see. Okay, so ignore the other buckets I have. I use this account to host like a bunch of other things as well. All right, if you notice, my name was Ocean Queen, right? You have three buckets that were created. Ignore the others. Do you have the same setup on your AWS console as well? Right? We ran the same set of commands, so you should also have the same commands there. Sorry, same buckets created. Yes, no, thumbs up. How many of you still running the commands? How many of you still running the commands? And use the raise hand. Okay. Alright, so if you notice the first bucket that's there, if you notice the first bucket that we've created, we have in the public bucket. If you look at what the bucket's configuration is, it says you have those two files that were just added here, and So the S3 interface, if you've not seen this before, you have Amazon S3 and then buckets, and then it tells you what the total storage is, right, across all of your buckets, and then you have your buckets listed here. So you go to the bucket that we're looking at right now, the Ocean Queen public hyphen bucket, and if you notice, it says the access is public, right? But don't be fooled by what AWS shows you here, because you can have access written as public, but the files may not be accessible, and the objects may not be accessible from within, from the outside. And that's interesting, because even if the bucket is accessible publicly, you can see the file contents, the object contents within the bucket, and you can't download if it's truly public. Right? From an attacker's point of view, if you can't download a file, the severity suddenly diminishes, right? It decreases significantly. Although giving away file object names is a, some business operations may not want to know what the object names are. Okay, so looking at this bucket, we have the objects within this. You can select any one of them and perform object specific operations, right? Or you can click on the object and it'll give you more information about that object. Let me open that in different tab for you folks. Okay. You look at the properties, you have bucket versioning, you have default encryption, right? It's automatically applied now. Relevant ones here, server access logging. So logging for S3 is another misconfiguration, so definitely this one it's disabled, right? Object logs, so that if you have uploaded an object, you can log the object and you won't be able to delete it, right? Who pays for the transfer of files, and if the bucket enables static website hosting, the one that I was talking about, where you can convert an S3 bucket to an HTTP endpoint. Looking at the permissions, which is more relevant to the class. Console is a little slow today. Okay, so you have permissions overview. It says access is public. Yay, good job here. But if you look at, there are two sets, right? So there's this thing called public block, right? So you have block public access, which is a essentially an ACL that can be applied to the bucket, that would then dictate whether the bucket can become public or not, right? So there are different block settings that are available. Okay, so currently all of them are disabled, right, because of the commands that we ran. And there's a bucket policy section where you can write specific policies to have IAM users or cross account access to your bucket enabled. Okay. ACLs are enabled on this bucket, which is not the default after April, right? If you notice, the all users group has list and write access to objects, okay, not to the bucket ACL for this one. Cool. So your task as part of the class now is to identify, let's quickly see what's part of the questions. Okay, so for each of these buckets, can you identify the bucket policy and just check if which of those buckets have a bucket policy, and if bucket policy is present, what does the bucket policy say? For the 3 buckets that you've created, identify the one that has a bucket policy on it. Right, there are 2 ways. The console way is what we've seen. You browse to the bucket and go to permissions and scroll down to the bucket policy section. But let's try and see how we can do this using the command line. Right? So quickly, AWS S3 ls -- profile plus. Give me a list of all S3 buckets in my account. And so there are a bunch of them. I'm going to look at the first bucket. So I have AWS 3 get bucket tab. Oh, sorry. Okay, so this is another thing. AWS has S3 for file operations. You can S3 create bucket, create object, and put object and stuff like that. And if you want to work with permissions and properties of the bucket configuration related, you have AWS S3 API, right, which is what you need to use. AWS S3 API get bucket right, bunch of options available. We're going to use get bucket policy and provide the bucket name. By class. Again, very useful if you have auto bucket name. Right, so this is the command line is very helpful like this. So I have S3 API get bucket policy, right? For this particular bucket, it says the bucket policy does not exist. Okay, so let's take a look at the next bucket. Folks, I want all of you to do this. The essence of doing this hands-on, getting familiar with the CLI as well is really important as part of the class, right? So let's take a look at the next bucket. There you go. So this bucket has a bucket policy attached to it. And what does the bucket policy say? The bucket policy name is public read, and the effect is allow all principals to get object within this bucket, right? So if you now go to the bucket and obtain the bucket URL, right? So let's obtain the bucket URL. How do you do that? You essentially go to any object within the bucket and then go to the root. We'll go to the full path. Root. So I picked it up from here and then removed port. You can also construct this back from the name of the bucket .s3.amazon.aws.com, s3.useast1.amazon.aws.com or s3.amazon.aws.com, both work. If you notice, file listing is enabled, object listing is enabled, right? We have both these files here. Cool. So coming to the second part of the question, can you identify who has the ability to read and write from the buckets? Right. So if we saw the bucket policy, how do you answer that? Who has the ability to read and write? Apparently everyone. They can read, they can get object, right? So write is not enabled. And just to make sure, you have to run two commands, right? So get bucket policy is one, and you have to also get bucket ACL. And bucket ACLs will also allow you to see if there is an ACL applied that allows folks to write to the bucket, right? As I said, policy and ACLs both work hand in hand to provide permissions to S3 buckets. So we do get bucket ACL. And you'll notice that all users, which is all AWS users, can read, and also dangerously all AWS user, as actually all users on the internet can read, and all users can write as well, right? So this is not authenticated users, which would mean AWS users, but this is all users, everybody on the internet, regardless of whether you have credentials or not, right? You can also read and write to these buckets. Okay, can one of you tell me what is the ACL? Actually, wait, before we go there, browse to the root of each of the three S3 buckets that we've created, and tell me the buckets that allow file listing, the object listing to be enabled, and which of those buckets allow for file to be downloaded, objects to be downloaded without requiring additional access. Don't do this with a command line in the browser, right? The way we usually find S3 URLs in the wild. See if you can browse to the root of the bucket and download file. Sorry about that. Are you folks trying this? Just browse to the root of the bucket. Yeah, just browse to the root of the bucket using the HTTP URL and tell me which bucket lists objects, right? And as I said, not all buckets that list objects would allow the object to be downloaded, right? So tell me which ones allow you to download as well. That on my system. There you go. So I take the first bucket, I go to the root of the bucket, I see that this has object listing enabled. If this is unreadable for some reason, you can always look at view source and line trap. Right? In my opinion, is easier to read, or whatever works for you, right? So you want to use this is okay. The key name are the object names, right? So you have boat and public. Let's just see if you can browse to boat. This is the end. Okay, that's interesting. So if you see, you have object listing enabled, but you can't access the object itself, right? So severity reduces for these buckets. Okay, can you try this with the second bucket as well? That the bucket's name is a dead giveaway. But interestingly, it doesn't have objects. Okay, we can use we can identify what the bucket's permission is, because this has the bucket policy that allows get object. Yeah, so you still have bucket listing enabled, and because the bucket policy, you know that you would be able to get objects as well, right? I leave that as an exercise for you folks. See if you can upload a file to this bucket and see if you can download the file without giving the extra permission of allowing individual file access. So for example, and you go back to buckets and look at the first bucket that we created. There are two objects here, right? So I go to boat.jpg and this is URL. I try to open this URL. It says access denied, right? But I can also have object actions set as make public using ACL. Okay. It says and warnings are a thing with AWS S3 and a bunch of other services now. Anything that's going to make your service or S3 especially, it's going to make it insecure. Especially things like if you're deliberately trying to make a bucket public, right? S3 is going to prompt you with so many warnings. It's not funny. So once here, when you're creating the bucket and you're trying to apply ACLs, that time as well, you can avoid all those warnings if you just use the CLI, by the way, right? So we just make this individual file public, and now I just browse to the same file, and there file download enabled. Cool. Anyway.
When you're creating a bucket, you permit
Yeah. You can't. By default, you can't make it public. Let's see what AWS says. No? It's the easiest way to confirm your hypothesis. Like, so you go create bucket. This is the way I learn new stuff about AWS or any cloud provider, right? You go to the real place and you try experimenting with what you have. Right, so I'll just create Riyaz unique bucket name. And if you notice, ACL is disabled, which is the recommended and default option, right? And ACL is enabled. If you have ACLs enabled, then you can apply bucket ACLs to make it public, and you can have permissions to for objects as well as bucket to even overwrite the ACL itself. Right? We'll go with ACLs disabled for now. And it says block all public access, right? So this is default. Like, see what happens when I remove this checkbox. Turning off with a big warning here saying turning off block public access will result in become public. I acknowledge, right? So I know that I'm going to be doing this. I need the bucket to be public, and then I go create bucket. And even then, any object that is uploaded to that bucket is not public. You have to make the object independently of the upload. You have to make for per object as public, unless you're like the bucket is created for S3 hosting, in which case you use ACLs. Right? Does that answer your question? All right, so let's take a look at what the ACLs are, right? So you have, I've created a bucket called session 3 masterclass. You can run this on the buckets that you've also created locally now. Get bucket ACL for session 3 masterclass. That's the name of the bucket you need to target now. And go ahead and complete these two tasks, right? So tell me what users can write to this bucket and upload a file from your computer to this bucket using the AWS S3 CP command. I'll give you a couple of minutes for this. Very important to understand that bucket policies and ACLs can both work against each other, and if you've identified a public bucket, it need not necessarily, and tools do this, right? Tools do this all the time. If you're going to run a bucket enumeration tool or say Prowler or other tools for CIS compliance and things like that, they'll tell you that they've identified a bucket that is public. But you really truly need to look at the bucket policy and the ACL to confirm whether you've got this. Right. And this is one of the things that I noticed when we were creating Cloudl as well, that most of these tools have a very high rate of false positives. We added additional checks to ensure we don't do that. Take a look at the ACLs and tell me for session 3 masterclass, what are the ACLs? And this, I own this bucket, right? But the fact that you can run get bucket ACL should tell you something by itself. You can't otherwise arbitrarily read ACLs of other people's buckets, right? So that'd be a problem on the internet. So if you notice, right now I'm using profile masterclass. I'll just use something else. Let's say, who am I right now? Okay, I have another account. So there are two different accounts. So without the hyphen profile, I'm actually a different account. So I'll run the AWS S3 API get bucket ACL bucket name masterclass. If I've set this up properly, you'll see. Oh, there. The bucket ACL shows that you can read the ACL all internet users, and you can change the ACL all AWS authenticated users. All right. Can you try uploading a file to this bucket? Again, as simple as AWS S3 CP source destination. So board.jpg to S3:/ bucket name. Call it something else. Because it's unique. Can you run that command and tell me if it succeeds or not? And let me put the command. Done, not done. Are you able to write? Okay. I don't see files being created here. Folks, are you trying this command? So I run. I can see the bucket contents. So this is the file that I uploaded now. No, try. See what happens. See, all cloud resources have to be treated. There's this whole thing about the concept of not to offend the animal type, but essentially pets and cattle. So cloud services and resources in the cloud are treated as cattle. You can create, destroy, recreate as many number of times, which is where the risk is much lower, unless you're like using like a data center where you're too worried about what would happen if. And so the easiest, fastest way to learn is to actually do the question that you have in your. As I said, I may not have the answers to all the scenarios that we're working on. The easiest is to identify what happens if. What happens if I rerun the command? Want me to overwrite it? Folks, are you trying the command? I still see only like one object. Upload any file. Some of you are spending time searching what file to upload. So when in doubt, when cases like this, I just take a screenshot of the area of one of my desktop corners, right? So I'll just take like a screenshot of a white space and then save that file and use that file. Or I do like a echo hello to a text file and then use that file. I've seen people be more elaborate. They'll go like open Microsoft Word and then write content and then save. Wrong class. Okay, while you folks are still working on this, let's just move to the next section. This is the time that we have. So, how do we find public buckets? We spoke about what the misconfigurations for a bucket are. You have buckets that have objects listed, right? So you get started with that. If you can list an object, the immediate next step would be to try and download the object. There are also buckets which don't allow for you to list the object, but you can download the object. So, but you need to know the file name, right? So that is a little more difficult scenario to work with. S3 bucket virtual hosted style paths are DNS compliant names, right? So each one of us had to create a unique bucket name, because on the AWS S3 namespace, you can't have buckets with the same name, right? This allows for an interesting scenario to occur. When you make a GET request to an S3 bucket, the response header would either be a 200 or a 404. And there are other error codes, but from an enumeration point of view, you'd have a 200, okay, bucket was found, right, and the object was listed, or you would have 404. A lot of tools that do bucket enumeration are based on this scenario, right? Because S3 virtual hosted style paths are DNS compliant. You can make a GET request. Tools like, there are tons of them, right? The bucket finder, Slurp, bucket dump, S3 num, S3 finder, whatever. There's like a huge list of these tools available, and you have a lot of folks who write these tools, customize them based on dictionaries that they have, if they're targeting on a specific organization, for example. If you're doing bug bounty in that case, and if you've identified what the naming convention of that organization is, you create custom dictionaries that have that naming convention. Like, say if they have hr-production.s3, right? So, and you have other departments, so marketing-production. So you would create a dictionary of common words with hyphen production or hyphen testing or hyphen staging, and then you run this dictionary using the dictionary. Essentially would do, the tool would take each word from the dictionary, make a domain name out of it, make a GET request, look at the HTTP response, and then tell you if the object or the bucket exists or not. And if the bucket if the response contains data and length is greater than something, then you know that bucket listing was enabled as well. So you have bucket identified and listing enabled. My favorite, although still to find arbitrary, the first using tools is focused. Like if you want to focus on a particular organization, but if you're like me, you tend to wander around. Google docking still works, right? And this is essentially a very cool way to identify and find buckets on the internet that may have sensitive information. I'll show you a command which I want you folks to try. Remember that accessing S3 buckets because they're public is one thing, but just be sensitive of the kind of data that buckets may have, right? You may actually stumble upon sensitive information which would constitute a data breach, right? And that's how data breaches for S3 happen. A bucket is found with a public object, and then someone downloads the object and discovers that they're fake credit card numbers or PII information, first name, last name, so Aadhaar card number. So just be wary of the file that you are accessing. I would recommend don't access the file itself, but just take a look at the search results. Okay, this is a very specific advanced Google search query where I'm restricting Google to search only for subdomains of s3.amazonaws.com, extensions of type XLS, XLSX, CSV, which contain the words password, pass, username, UID, email. So I'm trying to find Excel sheets that may contain username and password combinations using a Google Doc. Go ahead and try this. This is a fun exercise. While you folks are trying this, let me just log in into my Shodan account. Any interesting results? Yes, no? You can look at the domain names, and as I said, you can't be sure that the organization that's named in the S3 bucket owns the bucket in the objects, but in most cases you can be fairly certain. To actually truly confirm, you would have to write to the organization saying, hey, I found this bucket, looks like it belongs to you. $674. And you can obviously play with first one itself has. Don't recommend clicking on those because that will actually download the file on your just browse. You can actually play with XLS, XLSX, look at different extensions, right? Look at docx, right, or PPT, or look at some other data, have confidential in double quotes, right? Google docking essentially, but with S3 Amazon AWS.com as the top level domain. You can also do region specific, then S3.US-East1 and more. If I know a partial, can I use the search? Yes, you can do in URL, right? So if say for example group or whatever, and in URL, these are Google advanced operators. URL I. There's a similar to. You'll have to look this up. What the actual thing is, because in URL is for partial or complete parts of the word in that would come up in the URL. Shodan and census. How many of you've used Shodan before or seen or know what Shodan is? Shodan is a blessing in disguise for folks who want to keep stumbling upon things that are left open on the internet. You can use Shodan to find because it scans the entire internet almost every day and identifies hosts based on the services running, and if there's a makes an HTTP request to all open ports that are discovered, captures the response, and then it puts it in the search engine, right? So you can actually search for something like say product. It categorizes this. It knows that the product is S3. So this should give you some results. There you go, 56,200 buckets it's discovered, and the 301s. Okay. Interestingly, if you are a little if you try this a little more cleverly, what you can do is you can identify the string that buckets send back when they are listing objects. So if you have it's already open. Right, so get rid of the. If you notice now in the XML response that comes back, you have certain strings that are going to be common across all S3 if they allow object listing, right? So quickly looking at the view source, it will contain list bucket result XMLNS with this style sheet, XML style sheet, and name, right? You don't know what the bucket name is, but if you stick this into Shodan, it takes a lot of time because there are a lot of these buckets open. I haven't figured out a way to like restrict Shodan to give me results before it crashes, but the connection that you have with Shodan breaks, right? So it just essentially tells me that there's a lot of content out there. I've added the string search in your in the presentation as well, so maybe you folks can try this out. Okay, and one of the other cool example that I have, and some of you folks may be using this, is Grey Hat Warfare. So let me just open up Grey Hat Warfare. Grey Hat Warfare is considered to be like the Shodan specifically meant for storage, not only like S3 but for other cloud accounts as well. Suppose Azure and a lot of files and objects that it keeps discovering are added. I keep losing my tabs. Oh, so yeah, there you go. So you have Grey Hat Warfare. I'm logged in. I could search for say config and some buckets. And I'm just making an arbitrary search to see what it throws up. Over 9,000 results. I don't have a paid account with Grey Hat Warfare, at least not this one that I'm logged in. So premium users apparently can see 21,000 more. A nice upsell. But you have DigitalOcean Spaces, you have Azure Storage, right? I think GCS as well. All of these files which contain either the content contains the word confidential or the name of the object or the storage bucket name contains the word confidential. Right? Grey Hat Warfare is their free account is good to have POCs and stuff. Their paid account is even better. But they collect S3 and other storage information across the internet, and they've created like a catalog, right? So Shodan specifically for storage units on the internet. Screenshots of the examples that we saw with Google, Shodan I picked up yesterday night, and Grey Hat Warfare, the interface. Recommend this if you want to like identify and search for any random public buckets. You can again streamline the search to target specific organizations. All right, let's quickly go and undo the changes. I don't have a script for you folks because I want you to interface with the AWS console to do this. Just another exercise as well for you. Go ahead and delete the buckets in the objects created. Again, as any of my classes, if you want to keep this around and play with it for some time, you can keep them around for the next couple of days, or but because AWS storage itself doesn't cost money, but transfer has pricing, right? So AWS will charge you for the number of requests you make or the amount of data transfer from it. So go ahead and delete. It's straightforward. You select the bucket and delete the bucket itself. If it complains that your bucket is not empty, then delete the objects first. So links here, and please make sure that you fill the feedback, again a 2-minute feedback for today's class. That's all I had for today. I'll take questions or since we are at the end of our time here, you can always email me the questions that you have. Bring me able to answer. All right, I'll see you all again on the next session.